Bit of a different setup from last time. I'm probably sure you're aware this was recorded. This part of the video, the start of the intro part of the video, was recorded after I actually shot the remainder of the footage. And the reason for this is I was editing it during coronavirus, and we closed the studio on Friday, and it is now Wednesday when I'm just shooting this. So this is part 2 of the mixing drums with stock plugins and Logic. This is the second video in part of a series, so I'll put a link in the cards, which will probably turn up in the top right corner. I'd recommend watching that video first because this is actually carrying on from that. In this video, kind of exploring the snare processing with the reverb and then compression and gating, and then also just looking at balancing the overall drums, and then also a little bit of distortion and parallel processing on another particular mic. This one's a little bit longer than the first one, but I don't want to spend too much more time on that. If you do like the videos, please remember to like and subscribe. Any questions, please leave in the comments below. If you've got any requests for videos, I've got a form to fill out below as well, so please give me a shout. The next thing I've done, I haven't actually looked at the EQ of the snare just yet, but what I've actually looked at now is the kick in the snare, and I've gone from Chroma Reverb to the Space Designer, and I've used Space Designer so I can load a plate, something I normally tend to do with drums. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a channel EQ before the Space Designer. So what that'll let me then do, just close these all down. So now I've got the channel EQ. So all I've done on the channel EQ is I've low passed and high passed some of the sound on the reverb, so I'm not making it as bright. I'm kind of making it a little bit darker. I'm also getting rid of anything that I don't really need in the session. I'll do that across all EQ. Tend to make sure as I'm EQing, I'm kind of just getting rid of stuff that's not needed, and that's when it comes to mixing. You basically a lot of the time you're getting rid of stuff you don't need. So it just means that you're taking stuff out of the way, and it's just those kind of things are what causes issues when you're actually mixing. It's the build-up of low frequency information, high frequency information. It's just making sure that you're doing as much as you possibly can just to kind of just deal with the fundamental sound and not worry too much about stuff that isn't really wanted. So as we listen now, if we just have a listen to the reverb changes when I toggle the EQ before the reverb. So at the moment, the only thing that's going to the snail room, so this is a snare, this is going to be a plate. I'm going to rename the channel to plate, and then bus 21, so snare, I'm going to send the toms to bus 21 as well. So I just check what I'm checking as well with the sends is I'm making sure that they're unity, and I'm also making sure they're post fader. Now what that means is as I change the master fader for the snare and the toms, it will mean that the sends that are going to the plates, if I turn the snare down, I'll just mute this, I just solo the snare, that should also mean as I brought that fader down, the reverb has actually got a lot smaller. If we change this to pre-fader, what will happen now, as soon as I press play, you should notice that the plate volume is actually much, much louder. So other thing to notice is because I've changed it to pre-fade, the colour of the send changes as well. All you have to do is right click. All I did was right click this little arrow section. I made it pre-fader. So this has gone back to post-fader. Small, pre-fader, big. So just listen to that now. I'm going to just change, make it a little bit brighter. So I'm just going to change the high pass filter and make it. And also going to change the length. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to have a look at the snare top and bottom. I'm going to put an EQ and probably compress these as well. I'm going to put a compressor on the overall bus for the snare. I'm going to go stereo because it's actually just a mono signal anyway. And I'm going to go, so look, I want the classic VCA, which is based on a DBX160. So all I've got is threshold. I'm going to set the ratio to 4.1, and I'm going to make sure the auto gain is off. It's a setting that Logic has, so you can kind of set it to a certain level. I tend to leave it off just because of how I tend to work, and I'm just going to listen to the compress. What I want is about 2 to 3 dB compression, so I'm going to change this threshold. As you go, so as I move it down, you'll see that the needle starts moving a bit more. That's it, minus 3 is a bit too much. Okay, the other thing I'm noticing with this is there is a lot of bleed from the drums. So the next thing I'm probably going to look at is dynamics and look at a gate. So noise gate, what we got? A couple of things on this. There are 3 sections. So we have the first section, which is actually saying how the settings for the gate. So we set it to gate rather than ducker. A ducker might be useful for radio, for talking. You could set the sidechain up for the vocal mic to kind of duck music down for when you're talking, so automatically change it. For the gates, what I'm looking is the threshold is basically the point where I want the gate to start enacting. I don't really have a ratio that I might have on other gates in other DAWs like Pro Tools. So I've basically set the threshold to where I think is where it's only actually letting the snare through. So it's almost acting like a gate normally acts like a compressor in reverse. Anything below the point, the threshold, is where the gate will actually start acting and actually cut the signal down. Whereas with compressors, the compressor only start acting once it actually goes above the threshold. So what that means is, if I just take it off, we hear a lot of the kick You can hear a lot of the kick sounds. This is just a snare mic on its own. So it was minus 21. This is where I found that the gate was opening and closing. The next thing that I looked at was the characteristics. So this is like an internal sine chain. So I press monitor so I can actually listen. What I'm looking at with this is I'm listening for. It's almost like just an automatic sine chain internally. What I've done is almost like an EQ, similar to what we did with the reverb, where I've taken off a lot of the low end because I don't need the energy of the kick drum. I also took quite a bit of the high end out, which was really because I also noticed there was quite a bit of hi-hat bleed, and I just want to try and get as much of the fundamental sound as possible. And what that means is when the bandpass signal isn't what's actually going to be the output signal, but it's what the gate is acting upon. So that it's almost like it's like a separate side chain, which is actually what's listening. It's listening to that signal. It's ignoring all the low end. It's ignoring all the high end. It's only actually acting then upon what signal's being sent there. So this is what you're listening to now. So that's the sound of the bandpass side chain, and that's the monitor on. That's what we're listening to, and that's what the gate's acting upon. The next section, so the middle section is the final bit. So once I've actually got the threshold and the reduction of how much I want to make it, how much I want to actually reduce the signal by, I don't want to go extreme. So it was originally set to 100 dB. That can be quite a lot. The next thing I was looking at then is I set it to about 30 dB, and that was just purely preference from this moment in time. The next section then we've got attack, hold, and release. So the attack is how fast the gate closes, and the hold, how fast the gate opens. So it's when it comes over the threshold is how much actually the gate will open up. I found it was kind of popping a little bit too much when it was like a faster setting. I have a little bit of a hold, so that means once the signal from the snare drops below the threshold, the gate will stay open for 50 milliseconds. So that's like the literal second nothing opens, so it stays open. So 50 milliseconds it stays open, and then I've got this release, which is actually quite long, which is then how long it takes before it actually goes from open to close. It's about 300 milliseconds for close. I tend to have a quite long release with regards to gate, so it sounds a bit more natural. So it's 223. If I take this completely off, the reason I have it longer is I'm losing a bit of the fundamental sound of the snare, and it almost becomes like a trigger point, which isn't really what I want. So that's why I have it much higher, and it's starting to make the snare sound a little bit more natural. So this is now the snare gated and gated off. And as I was listening, the other thing I noticed with the track as well, there's quite a few ghost notes on the snare. So I've actually dialed the threshold down a little bit, so it actually picks up the ghost notes as much. So it's going to bring a bit of the kick drum in, but it's not too much of an issue. The next thing I'll probably do is I'm going to copy the settings over to the snare bottom. EQ. Go 12. So we've got the snare. I've got the snare kind of at a point where I think it might be okay. The next thing I'm going to look at is the overheads. Okay, what I'm going to do with the overheads, I'm going to set up a new bus 15, so that should create a new track. And we're going to call this room. Let's have a look what we got. So it's going to go to a reverb. And what I want to do is, the room is quite tight and quite So I've got a rough level. So what I've actually done is I've just tweaked around with some of the presets in Chroma Reverb, and it's basically just sending a reverb to a new bus, and that's just Chroma Reverb on its own. I'm using large wooden room. I don't think I've really changed any of the settings. See if we can solo that on. I'm not looking for something that's overpowering the drums. I'm not looking for something that kind of stands out. I'm just trying to make something that blends in to make it like a bit more 3D. So once I have a look at the rooms, I might send that to the room reverb with the Chroma Reverb here, which is bus 15. So and what I tend to do is when I'm mixing drums, I kind of try and move quickly, and I'll try and just kind of bring a balance up and down quickly. So look at bringing this kick drum now up and back in. So I'm just going to start looking. It's got a rough balance of drum mics. So the next thing we have is the crotch mic. And I I think I'm going to go for distortion on this, and I think I'm going to go Bit Crusher when I find it. Utility, specialize, bass, Bit Crusher, distortion. So with the crotch mic, the other thing that I'm going to look at is, as I'm cycling through the distortion, the one thing I'm noticing is I do get a lot of cymbal noise. So I'm just going to bring an EQ in and do a low pass filter of the cymbal sound. So of the three, going through that, I think the Distortion 2 was probably the one I ended up going for. The main reason being is for the mix blend, so I was around about 81%. And I ended up on Nasty, and it is just a case of cycling through and seeing what I want to do, because I've already got quite a lot of the information with all the plugins already. Well, look. So this mic's normally kind of, when you're drumming, it's normally like this bass be kind of over the kick drum pointing down, and it's getting quite a nice slap of the kick and the snare. And it's something that when we look at when I tend to do is just kind of look at distorting that and using that as like a overall harmonic enhancer for the drums, and something that like you miss, something that you won't notice when it's there, but something that you might miss when it's not. Which is a similar case actually as well for the room and the plate that I've got set up now as well. Is like they're there doing what I want them to do, and not getting in the way too much either. So thanks very much for watching. I'm more than for getting this far. The next video will be the final part of the series in terms of mixing drums with Logic on this song, with the stock plugins and Logic. After that, there's 2 more videos to come out, or possibly 1. It will be looking at how I'd normally mix the drums using something else. I'll be using Softube Console 1 just to show you the workflow, how I normally work a little bit differently. But yeah, please give me a like and subscribe. If you have any questions, as always, leave me a comment in the section below, and I'll see you all again next time.